My name is Shlomo Angel. I'm a professor of city planning at the Marin Institute of Urban Management at NYU. And today I'm chairing a session titled Urban Design, Planning, and Governance. We have 5 presenters in this panel, and I'll introduce each one of them briefly and then let them present their research. Their presentation should be 3 minutes with a possible extension, but not beyond 5 minutes. It will be followed by a set of questions from me and then from the audience at large. You can write your questions in the chat, and then we will introduce them to the participants. The first presentation is by Neil Kliemann and Alexander Shermansong. Neil is a political science professor, and Alexander is a adjunct faculty member but they're both the Wagner School and at CUSP. And what they're going to be talking about is a topic which is now, I believe, extremely hot, which is studying and changing the institutional culture of municipal government institutions. This has become a very critical question. We hear now in the news every day about the need to change the culture at police departments, in the armed forces. Here we have a focus on municipal governments. The second presentation is going to be by Blagovesta Momchedjikova. She's at the Tisch School of the Arts at the writing program. She teaches writing, and she specializes in writing about cities. She's written a lot about cities, including poetry. And she's become interested in pan-stereoramas, which are these kind of parks that give you a picture of some larger whole. My personal experience, and it was a very good one, was in Ancient City, which is a park 20 kilometers outside Bangkok in Thailand that has all the temples. It has, but the shape of Thailand, and then it has all these different architectural styles at a half scale. So you can walk through the country and see how it looks. You have a kind of an overview of the entire country. She's going to talk about these pan-stereoramas. The third presentation will be by Jon Ritter. He's a clinical associate professor at the NYU Department of Art History, Urban Design and Architectural Studies. And he is an urban historian. And he will talk to us again about a hot subject, which is basically takings or condemnation of public land for public use. And this again has become a hot topic, especially after the 2005 Keller versus New London, which is got basically the left versus the right in a struggle that saying you cannot just keep on using public powers to benefit private developers. And that the takings clause in the Constitution is about taking for public works and for roads and railways and ports, but not for private development. So Jon is going to tell us something about that. This is, again, a very timely topic. Then the fourth presenter will be Julia Payson. She's an assistant professor of politics at New York University. And she's going to talk about the history of municipal efforts to legislate reforms, and whether in the last century and the beginning of last century, and whether these reforms benefited immigrants. And again, this chimes with the current you know, Biden's program to get a very large immigration reform through Congress, and also with what we have been seeing for the last 4 or 5 years, and that is municipal institutions, cities taking their own initiatives about migration, regardless of what the federal policy is. We've seen these sanctuary cities and other local initiatives. So Julia's work speaks to that. Finally, we have the fifth speaker is Victoria Alsina Burgess. She is an industry assistant professor and academic director at the NYU Center for Urban Science and Progress, CUSP. And she's going to speak about a topic which is close to what Kliemann and Shermansong are going to speak about. She's going to speak about rethinking public institutions and the connections and the interactions between these institutions and public engagement. This is, again, a hot topic where we see, on one hand, calls for more public engagement, there's, you know, participatory budgeting, and on the other hand, we can see resistance from people like my colleague who's written about the home voter hypothesis, namely that homeowners now have so much power to prevent urban reforms from taking place, so we've become too participatory. So anyway, the issue of how much participation citizens should have in government planning and government decision-making will be the focus on what Victoria is going to talk about. So this kind of, my introduction was trying to put these things in kind of the modern contemporary context and why I think all of these things are very interesting. And now I will turn to Neil, who will talk to us about his research on municipal culture.
All right, thank you. So as you see from the graphic, the elephant in the room, organizational culture, this is really a research project that grew out of work that Alexandra and I are leading with Raquel, where we host something called the Smart Cities Institute, which is a collaboration of New York University and the US Conference of Mayors, where every 6 months, this is pre-pandemic, we would bring about 10 mayors to NYU to essentially go to data and technology school. And it's a remarkable program, and we've trained about 30 mayors so far. We're going to do it again after the pandemic ebbs. And we would ask the mayors, before we really got into their smart city visions, what their greatest barriers and obstacles are to smart cities or to, you know, innovation in general. And again and again and again, they said organizational culture. And they looked to us as researchers to have something to say about it. And there isn't much. When the mayors would fly into the airports, they could look at the magazine racks and find 5, 6, 7 periodicals, whether Harvard Business Review, Fast Company, Bloomberg Business Week, all talking about organizational culture within the private sector. And yet there's almost nothing written about organizational culture within local government. So we started off this study clarifying just a basic definition of organizational culture, which are the assumptions and rules that determine what actually gets done in the workplace. For this study, we were supported by Bloomberg Philanthropies and then also worked with colleagues at the Kennedy School at Harvard. And so because it was affiliated with Harvard and the study should be out in about 2 months, it had a case study or case approach. And so we worked very intensely with 3 cities that we identified as engaging in at least an intentional attempt to transform culture within City Hall: Kansas City, Missouri, Louisville, Kentucky, and Somerville, Massachusetts. And it was a very extensive year that we spent with these cities, including 75 interviews with the mayors themselves, mid-level supervisors, and also frontline workers. We also had a survey that went out to over 100 workers and an extensive document review, including budgets. And we came up with something that we're calling the culture cascade. So I want to be clear, we think that these three cities engaged in significant cultural transformation, but none of them were complete. But each of them together provide real direction for what other cities can follow. And so we broke this down into three main areas, which is leadership, communications and decision making, and then cementing culture change through HR and data systems. And these are somewhat similar to key themes and principles and counsel that you'll find in private sector culture change strategies, but somewhat unique to government. So very quickly under leadership, you have to define vision and values, and often these are the words that you use. So a little bit similar to strategy, but more about the actual words like competition or collaboration. And it helps to explain the why somebody is doing what they're doing. Number two is you really need one staff person whose job it is every day to manage the culture change process. And then connected to that is the senior staff that understand this. In Louisville, we spoke to a chief of staff who said that she was a lawyer. She had no idea what all this culture meant, but she learned it. And they actually developed a culture dictionary for Louisville that she studied very well and adopted the culture. And then to activate the change has a lot to do with communications. One of the main ways is you must have a mechanism to ensure that culture change is happening, which cities now have through programs like CityStat and CompStat. And then you have to really prove that you're putting your money where your mouth is. Number three here is reflecting the culture change and actual budget decisions and policies. And finally, to cement the culture change, what some of the cities began to do, but none of them did fully, you need to actually change HR policies and hiring practices, and also ensure that there's a robust training system in place to inculcate the culture that you're aiming to advance. And then finally, include it in the data systems and norms within the institution. So I'm going to stop there and quickly ask my co-author and partner, Alexander, are there any bullet points you would add that I might have missed?
That was a great summary. I can't wait to hear people's questions. So
great.
I'm going
So we'll
to save
end
my
there.
time for those questions.
I think that was 4 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Neil. That was perfect. Timing was great.
Shlomo, did we stump you?
Pardon? Okay, so now let's move to Blagovesta and the pan-stereoramas. Great. Except that we don't see you now.
Unmuted. Oh, how about
okay.
now?
Now
Yeah.
it's fine.
Now it's good.
Please, go ahead.
So I decided to get rid of the fancy word pan-stereorama, but Shlomo, I would love to know the details about that park you've seen. So my presentation is called Urban Miniature Parks, a comparative study of amusement. So those of you who were here last year probably know of my fascination and remember my fascination and work with miniatures. Which starts off with a panorama in the Queen's Museum of Art. But this fascination has expanded towards larger areas such as parks that are populated by many miniatures. So this is what I wanted you to know briefly about. The first slide is from Miniaturk in Istanbul, Turkey, which is a park in existence since 2003. So the, well, and now how do I go to my next slide? Because I cannot go through here. Yeah, maybe, oops, okay, there it is. Thank you. So here you have two other slides. So one is from Mini Europe in Brussels, Belgium, which opened in 1989. And the one on the bottom is from, oops, I'm sorry, is from Mini Bulgaria Park in Veliko Trnovo, Bulgaria, which is most recent since 2017. So I want to briefly point to several interesting features of these miniature parks, as well as some problems that these features generate. So as I said previously, this is like a mecca of miniatures. The most fascinating thing probably is the proximity visitors can have to various structures. So the proximity allows you to almost touch the structures, take pictures from up close with them, have pictures with several significant landmarks, let's say in one frame, which is fascinating. But the problem here is, or the drawback can be that, of course, if they're in parks, often also called open air museums, they're subject to inclement weather, to careless visitors. Now, one great thing about these miniature parks, which speaks to their popularity, is that they're very convenient and very cost effective. So you can see way more stuff, way more structures that you can see in the real city or in a whole country or even in a continent. For way less time and obviously for way less money. Now, the problem here is that each of these structures is really taken out of context, out of its original context. So you only have to really interpret them in the context that the miniature park puts them in. Another interesting feature is that you get education, but through entertainment, which is a fun way of learning too. The problem here is that oftentimes the park spins its own, of course, narrative, such as with Mini Europe. A lot of the critiques were that it spins the narrative of unification, unity, peace, which is not quite of course, what happens in real life. Another interesting feature is the personalized learning you get here. Obviously, you can have the experience that the miniature is built for you. You can study it from up close by yourself. But the problem with that is that these structures are often just certain structures singled out of their original context. So whenever you have that, you have obviously the drawback of misrepresentation, of generalization. For instance, Bulgaria, which is I come from originally, is represented in Mini Europe through Rila Monastery. It's a monastery, it's a very iconic structure, but it makes you wonder, why is the whole country represented by that one building? Another feature, and I'm almost done, is the design collaboration. So these parks are often obviously the product of teamwork, which has its fascination, but at the same time, a problem that the uniformity of design and vision is often not quite there. And finally, they're interactive, as I've been trying to say, which is really something that rarely you can have in the real city the same way you can have here. The element of play is always used and can be built upon. The problem is that the park actually induces this very exemplary behavior. So when you are there, you're an exemplary visitor, an exemplary citizen, if you want, of a city, of a larger environment. And so my larger thing has been that these parks, no matter how fun and fascinating, actually function as elements of social control, where leisure is monitored. How do we move through a space while we are at leisure? So an interesting question here is, how many miniature parks do you think exist, if we can even claim that they're very popular? It really depends on who you ask. According to the International Association of Miniature Parks, there are 16. According to Wikipedia, 60. According to Mini America, another site, 100. So part of my project began as I was learning about them and researching to actually really create a more comprehensive database, which I do have, which I can share, and which I hope I'll find a host for that can let me maintain it. Many of these parks did not contain, curiously, miniature parks that I have visited, which is why I realized that there's no centrality to the information. And just as this, well, kind of like the final slide, I just wanted to show you here the slide from, well, that's how it's going to be. It's not going to get bigger. This is from 1929, and this park is still in existence in England, Beaconscott Motto Village. You see Maduro Dam from 1952. So the history is really not that complicated. They come from private gardens where the owners had miniature structures and trains, and they started opening them up to the public, and that started really in the early 20th century. But I would very much like to leave you with this last slide, and that last slide is really for you to think of how these miniature parks awaken wonder in us. I always think of that little child from the Holiday Train show in the New York Botanical Garden, another miniature park. And I would like to leave you at that, despite the fact that they're fun and they're maybe more so heritage than history, and maybe they bring up a lot of utopias and things that are not so innocent, you know, in terms of how things are represented. I still think there's an element of wonder in them that leaves us, at least me, breathless when I see them. So that's why I say it's I'm wonderstruck. So in my larger work, I use Stephen Greenblatt's discussion of wonder from Marvelous Possessions to see how miniature parks awaken wonder in us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Blagovesta. We will now move to the third presentation by Jon, please.
Sorry, can you see my slides? Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Shlomo, and to the other presenters. So my work is, as Shlomo said, it begins with an interest in not only the idea of eminent domain and public takings of private property for public use, but in particular a phase, kind of little known phase of American history, wherein in New York State, for example, there was a short-lived law that allowed municipalities to exercise what was called excess condemnation, that is taking more property than was necessary for the improvement in order for various reasons. And so my work looks at what those reasons are and what the arguments for and against it were, and what the outcomes of this kind of condemnation and excess condemnation of property, what its legacies are for the city after the progressive era, when this kind of emerges, into the urban renewal era and down to today. So I began to think about this in terms of when you go down 6th or 7th Avenue, the areas that were extended south in Manhattan in the teens and the 20s for the extension of the subway. What you see in the street frontage is this kind of ruined quality of the facades that were taken, and what's left behind is the kind of interior courtyards and interior walls of the buildings that lined the streets before, but the buildings have been taken for the widening or actually the cutting through of the street, as you see here. And this kind of very American idea of kind of leaving behind the ruined streetscape is very distinct from examples I'm sure you'd be familiar with in Europe. For example, Haussmann's Paris, where the street facades were rebuilt in an architecturally coordinated, monumental way to create a sense of a kind of urban order and structure, which is rather absent from the New York experience. In the case in the progressive era of the early 20th century, if you look through the literature on this, there was a great admiration for, in particular, the modernization of a part of London on the north bank of the Thames, which was called the Kingsway and Aldwych project, that was taken by the London County Council according to exactly this principle of excess condemnation. So financially, the council was able to condemn and take all the property, not just for the roadway itself, as would have been done in New York, but also the adjoining properties. And then the council or the municipality was able to hold the property and then resell it at a profit in order to finance the cost of the improvements. The argument here being financially that the municipality was able to recoup the cost of the improvement through the increase in the land value that occurs due to the improvement, right? And those of you are familiar with this literature, sometimes this was posed as a way to capture the so-called unearned increment that was created by public investment that was often accrued then to private property owners, right? So the idea here is to take that unearned increment of value away from the private property owner, bring it back into municipal or public circulation, and not only recoup the cost of the improvement, but also redevelop the city in a unified, harmonious way. So again, at the Kingsway, you tend to see, unlike the New York facade and streetscape, a kind of harmonious architectural unity. Again, more typical of what we might see in House One's Paris than in New York. So in my research, I do some case studies that follow along with this. I look at some specific sites that were taken under eminent domain and excess condemnation. In particular, I won't go deeply into it, but here at the area, it's now the New York City kind of civic center, there was some takings of private property that left over this little margin of space when the street was widened, as we could see in 1903. And so when there was a project that was proposed but not completely built to build a civic center in the area we called Foley Square today, this area was taken through excess condemnation to create a kind of a possibility of a unified site for municipal, federal, and state buildings. Eventually, they were built in a kind of piecemeal fashion over the course of the rest of the century. But this site, again, eventually got folded into, and again, if we follow close, as I do in my case study, follow the kind of history of this site and its development, it got folded into the federal building and the World Court that's erected there. And actually, quite literally, this was the site of that rather controversial public sculpture and kind of urban intervention called Tilted Arc by Richard Serra, which some of you may know about and which we could talk about further in the question and answer if you wish. But again, to understand this site, you'd have to go back into the long history of eminent domain, excess condemnation, and ideas about both urban beautification in the progressive era and kind of recoupment of public investment. So then finally, to finish up, I traced some of these sites also in my research further into the urban renewal and contemporary era. With the widening of Delancey Street in 1904 for the Williamsburg Bridge, you saw the leftover here spaces of one-story kind of taxpayers that take the place of the widened empty street, and you can see left behind the kind of ruins of the light wells of the old tenements that are exposed when the street is widened and the buildings that used to front on the street are taken. And what this left was a kind of unfinished city that then, consequently in the 1940s and 50s, looked to planners like blight. Right. So to some extent, these sites, while we can imagine they were used by, small scale stores and shop fronts and things that might have had a vibrant life in the way we would understand them today, in the 40s and 50s, this looked like a kind of incomplete and ugly city. So it, in a way, was a self-fulfilling prophecy that led to the demolition and clearance of the entire area. And I have other case studies that show that if you trace the life of some of these what were called in the progressive era remnants, gores, and gashes in the urban fabric that were left over from eminent domain. If you trace them, you see in many cases they appear again in urban renewal sites. So they kind of fulfill the prophecy of blight that follows in later generations. And then finally, just to finish up, I've also looked at other sites where we might see today a kind of opportunistic quality of these spaces. So some of these leftover sites become sites of what we would call a kind of urban informality. So for example, and some of you who work in the Puck building will know the site that I'm talking about here, the widening of Houston Street again in the 30s and 50s, also led to these little margins of extra space that were kind of improvised. So the so-called Happy Boy fruit stand that stood there at Houston and Broadway just by the subway station was part of a lot of people's kind of daily round. It was a produce station. It was a place of kind of social meeting in the urban fabric. And again, it was possible only because of this kind of remnant or remain that had never been really fully recouped into the urban fabric. And only today, when real estate interests have recouped it into a kind of profit-making venture, has that Happy Boy been closed and demolished and said, you guys, I should update this as a rendering, but now the building is there, of the building that lines a very shallow site on Houston Street today. And then finally, some of these sites on Houston Street, these slight widenings can become sites of urban art, of graffiti, of innovation in the 1980s, of small scale kind of local serving commerce and retail. Again, these small irregular sites provide kind of opportunities for informality that can't take place in the more regular, I guess, urban fabric of the city. And then finally, places like this. This is a little gas station on 7th Avenue that again occupies a little interior courtyard of a space that had been revealed when 7th Avenue was widened. And we can see here there's a student that student of mine took, where this becomes a kind of opportunity for informal collective worship. A group of Muslim cab drivers here worshiping together in this kind of little aside, this little void of street that was left over, never recuperated into the fabric of the city under eminent domain, but yet provides a kind of vibrant place of everyday life, right? Of informality, of urban life that springs up in these little voids. And again, I have lots of examples in my research of little spaces like this that are kind of left over, they're afterthoughts, but yet people use them, right? People find in a city like New York opportunities in these spaces. And I've gone well over my time, I apologize, but again, many more examples I can share, and perhaps we will. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, John. We move on. The next presentation is by Julia. Please.
Great, thank you so much. I have another paper for you on the progressive era. So the research that I'm going to be teasing for you today is how did progressive era reforms affect the labor market outcomes and economic mobility of immigrants in US cities? So there's a rich literature describing how the goals of progressive era reformers were often really contradictory. So on the one hand, many progressives wanted to improve urban living and working conditions and do things like expand access to education. But this was also a movement driven primarily by white and middle-class WASPs who were often pretty racist and nativist and afraid of socialism. And especially at the local level, a lot of the city reforms that progressives supported were explicitly designed to reduce the political power and participation of poor and immigrant communities. This quote by the economic historian Thomas Leonard sums up this dynamic nicely. But the historical record paints a very mixed picture about whether and how the municipal reforms that were enacted during this period actually affected the economic mobility of immigrants. So scholars have conducted a lot of case studies of individual cities or of individual immigrant groups like the Irish or Italians, but the results often point in different directions or are very case specific. So we don't really have good systematic evidence about the overall effects of these reform efforts. So in our research, we rely on newly de-anonymized individual level census data from 1900 to 1940 that allows us to follow both individuals and father-son pairs over time as cities experiment with different types of reforms. And we focus specifically on the most common political reforms of this era, which were largely aimed at rationalizing city government, cleaning up machine corruption, and decreasing the political participation and political power of immigrant communities. And what we do is we link these various reforms to a bunch of different outcomes, including things like how big is the wage earning gap between native born and immigrant men, and how much are sons earning relative to their fathers across cities. And the approach is basically to observe how these outcomes evolve in different cities over time as cities adopt various combinations of these institutional reforms. And our preliminary evidence suggests that the places that adopt more of these reforms experience a slight increase in the wage gap between immigrants and native-born men. It's pretty small, and we're still in the process of conducting robustness checks and thinking about different ways to specify our models and outcomes. But we're really excited to see what these amazing data can reveal about how municipal institutions affect the economic prospects and upward mobility of immigrants. And eventually we're hoping to expand this project to look at income inequality more generally, to dive more specifically into different regions, and to look at outcomes for women and African Americans as well. So I feel like I've just gotten started and piqued your interest, but I am trying to stick to the 3-minute limit. So during the Q&A, I would love to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Julia. So now we are on the final presentation, and we're going to ask Victoria to continue.
Thank you so much to all of you. I will try to be brief like Julia and to reserve some of the presentation for the Q&A, so let me share my screen, and here we are. So I'm thrilled to share with all of you one research that I've been working with for the last couple of years. This is a research about civic engagement, and more precisely, how can we institutionalize civic engagement, right? So this is part of the work that I'm doing at the GOP Lab at the Tandem School of Engineering. And after reviewing good practices from around the world, we realized that almost all engagement opportunities that exist, basically they have three limitations that repeat again and again, right? One limitation is that the engagement opportunities focus a lot on asking opinions and preferences to the people, but not really asking for their expertise. The second limitation is that normally they are justified in terms of improving legitimacy, and that's perfectly fine, right? But they are not explained, or they are not justified also for improving efficiency of the decision making. And a third limitation is that in these cases, normally people don't put enough attention in how public institutions, or more precisely cities, are going to digest the collected information to really support the subsequent decision-making process. A fourth limitation that maybe is not as strong as the previous ones, but it also happens a lot, is that if you review the policy-making cycle, all participation opportunities normally happen in the first stage, just for identifying problems or priorities. But they don't happen, for example, in the co-creation stage, when you want to implement policies or when you want to evaluate them. So this full project, the Multi-City Challenge, is one initiative that tried to overcome all these limitations. And basically, the starting point of the entire initiative is that we really think, when we started to work with cities and testing this model, that public institutions need to work differently, need to use more data, need to use more public engagement, need to be able to tap in expertise from different sources, right, to solve the complex problems they are facing. And also about the fact that to find this expertise that they need, they don't need to look far away, because they have a lot of expertise from the city residents themselves that they should use and reuse and incorporate in the policy-making cycle. So the Multi-City Challenge then is a proposal, is a methodology that we implemented at the city level, that what it does is it selects a pool of cities that share common challenges, right? And what it does is that these cities work together between them and with their residents to really define problems that they share and to find solutions promoting open innovation. As you can see here, the entire project has three stages. First of all, a training stage in which we offer training to the civil servants, more precisely in public problem solving, to help them to frame the challenges that the cities that participate together in this challenge want to accomplish. And after, what we do is that we organize, they define problems together, we do an open challenge. And this open challenge frame different problems and ask to the citizens to share their ideas. And here we have citizens and local NGOs and organizations and companies sharing ideas. After, we have a jury of experts that judge these ideas. And for the winning ones, we provide coaching, and we allow them to do pilots and scale and test what they suggested in order to validate this. Just the final comment is about the two main implementations that we did about this model. First of all, we did an implementation in Mexico. We selected 5 cities in northern Mexico, and they have been working together for the last 1.5 years, defining these problems, doing an open challenge, finding solutions, and finally implementing pilots. And the second case in which we implemented this model is in Africa, working with UNDP. In this case, we have been running this in 5 different African cities that you can see in this map. We have been working with Accra, Kano, Bahir Dar, Kampala, and Mutare. And we had a huge success in both places. This means all the city councils involved from the beginning until the end, thousands of proposals that we received using two different platforms. In one case, Consul, and in the other case, Your Priorities. And after more than 300 ideas in each case that we received, we picked the winners, 10 in the case of Mexico, 5 in the case of Africa. And we did the pilots to test these ideas. In the case of Mexico, 7 out of 10 were successfully implemented and institutionalized at the municipal level. And in the case of Africa, we are still running the pilot. So we are really hopeful to see how it works. I will stop here. I don't want to use more of your time, but I will love to answer more questions during the debate that it comes after. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Can you? Yes, thank you. Thank you all for the presentations. I found them fascinating. Let me kind of reflect a little bit with a set of questions or requests for clarification from the different presenters. From Neil and Alexander, the framework you presented is fine with me, but what I would like to hear from you a little bit for the common viewer is what, in your view, are good examples of institutional culture and bad examples, and where you've seen the transformation from bad to good in the places, in the 3 cities that you worked in. And in Blagovesta, I saw that you were very critical of these miniature parks and tried to kind of get behind the political ideology behind them. I assure you that it exists. But what I found is maybe there's another issue, which is one of scale. And that is these mini parks always kind of present these little small things at a smaller scale, which makes them cute in a way. And there are other places where things are presented at scale, which are much more socially aware. So when you look at, let's say, in Oslo, there are a couple of parks with historical houses and barns that you can go in and see how people lived. Or when you look at, let's say, Amish museums, or when you look at the Tenement Museum in New York City, you have places where you're trying to recreate life, but you give people much more of a social feeling of how life was in Bulgaria during that time that you cannot achieve when you're scaling down these presentations. So I wondered what your comments on this are. But I think that there's something very attractive about electric train landscapes, and that it stays with us when we grow up, so that there's something that connects you directly to these miniature parks. But I wanted to ask you what you can tell us about scale. Jon, I know the story of excess condemnation, and I just wanted to add to your research that Haussmann also wanted to have excess condemnation, but the council ruled against it. So he ended up borrowing a lot of money and getting into a lot of trouble with excessive loans that he took from private banks to do his projects. Excess condemnation does exist today in urban planning, particularly in what we call land pooling and readjustment, which is a system of creating urban expansion areas by converting land from rural to urban use, getting all the landlords together, replanning it with streets, giving people back 60% of the land of what they had, and using the remainder for public roads and open spaces, but also to fund the infrastructure.
Right.
And the latest example are the attempts at the town planning schemes in Ahmedabad, but it was practiced in Australia and Germany and Japan at quite a large scale. So I wanted to know whether you believe it's still a tool, whether you know, instead of saying this is history, you know, this is something, but there's something sensible about that we need to think about whether we can continue or whether we can present your work in a way that says this is still relevant today. Julia, when I heard you, I wanted to ask you whether there were specific policies of these municipalities that you thought had strong effects compared to others. It's not just, yes, there were municipal reforms, but some of them had a more impact on immigrants than others. And I wondered whether you can get a little bit more specific instead of just talking about the progressive reform era. And finally, Victoria, it's interesting that you mentioned the kind of the use of expertise or the kind of local expertise. I want to point out to you that one of the reasons that local officials shy away from that is that there's a risk associated with it. And that is when you start to involve the local experts, especially the very highly respected ones, they can actually destroy your plans. And the story that comes to mind was the mayor of Jerusalem, Teddy Kollek, after the Six-Day War, spent a lot of time creating a master plan for Jerusalem, the kind of how to unify the city and how to make it a kind of a more international city, and put a lot of energy into that. And then he finally invited a group of international experts, you know, big architects from all over the world, and they came and they shot down that plan completely. And Jerusalem never recovered and never had a master plan since. So some of these restrictions on participation are sensible in the sense that there's a risk associated with them. And I'd like you to speak a little bit about where you see too little participation, but also where you see too much participation. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to the panelists. And these are just by way of starting. You can also comment on other people's presentation when you respond. So let's start with Neil.
So he presented, so I get the hard job of answering questions, right? So actually, I hate to do this, but we would challenge the premise of your question that there's a good and a culture. What we're seeing is that there's a fit between culture and aspiration. And so what we're seeing in cities, and I think this is what a premise that we brought from private sector literature and see that applies in cities, is that depending on what a mayor or city leaders are trying to accomplish, the culture just might not be in line with that ambition. So for example, if, as we saw in Louisville, trying to be a lot more focused on both day-to-day improvements as well as opportunities for radical breakthrough in performance. And so that was changing a mindset in the city to focus on two different layers of performance in a really structured way. And in Somerville, in contrast, that the mayor has been creating a culture of innovation, but the pressures that he's responding to are much more the need to professionalize the workforce and to move it out of what they call slummer, used to call it Slummerville, right? And make it connect the workforce that he has to his ambition to attract a really skilled and growing income resident. And so by creating a culture that is more responsive to residents' needs and always looking to find something new that's exciting for people to make them want to move to Somerville, that then creates the result that he has, tying the culture to that result. So I think in each case, we're seeing where there's a policy and the culture is creating a framework around where that's fertile for that policy outcome.
Thank you.
I was curious for you guys, I mean, have you thought about, or did it figure in your study, the kind of assumptions behind culture change in the first place? You know, who is shaping the new priorities, and is there participation of the presumably staff in buying into this? Is this part of success as well?
Yeah.
Or the reformer gets there, you know, or the implementer gets there?
So this is exactly what we saw, the difference between culture change and leadership change, right? So leadership change is, you know, you put a new person in charge of a department, or you elect a new mayor, and they can assert new policies, have new press conferences, change the budget, things like that. And that's not the same as changing the culture. What you're talking about is actually getting buy-in from the organization. That's what changing the culture is. And that's in Neil's presentation. He talked the third layer, cementing the culture. That's the hard part. That's why this takes years and not months. In fact, we think it takes more than a term. So mayors that really want to do this need to, if they're term limited, get going right away on their first term in order to have the runway needed to drive that change. And it's really about changing the mindsets throughout the organization, changing the hiring and promotion programs, so you're attracting the people who match that, which creates reinforcing, as well as promoting people that clearly embody that culture, so that it's seen that you're actually doing what you say you're doing, as opposed to just talking about it and then doing the same old business. Yeah. So I think you hit that's the hard part, what you said. Yeah. As you knew when you asked the question, right?
Of course, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can just say
Sorry,
thank you
I
for the
was
comments,
muted.
Shlomo. I appreciate it.
Can I ask Blagovesta to comment?
Oh, you're
I think
muted.
you are muted. Yes.
Yes. Sorry. Thank you for the question about scale. It's a very important question. Scale does wake up the child in us, because we are used to playing with trains, toy trains. So it wakes up this. And in these miniature parks, what matters is the reversal of scale. When you asked me this question, I realized, yes, those other environments, I mean, historic Richmond town on Staten Island is another example. So whenever we have these recreations of houses and stuff like that, where they're bigger or to actual size, the aim is to replicate the life that maybe happened there. But with miniature cities, it sounds like miniature parks, that's not the goal. It sounds like they very much rely on the reversal of scale, so that we feel like giants when we are there, and this childlike thing is awoken in us. And I think this is very crucial in terms of how we see them, how we experience them. It's all about the exterior. So what is minimized is the exterior, versus these other experiences that you suggested, where we get to see the internal, the interior of a house. Or thank you. I don't want to take more time. I know other people need to respond too.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, thanks for your comments. I really appreciate them. And you're quite right about Paris, certainly. And Haussmann, as you know, had to create the Crédit Immobilier, an entire banking structure to finance those debts. And I didn't mean to say that it was financed under eminent domain. So thanks for that clarification. But more broadly, I appreciate your perspective as a historian. And I think you probably saw the email I sent you this morning with the question about kind of interdisciplinarity here.
Yes.
How is a historian right? Do I connect to the present? And again, I mean, for me, tracing the afterlife of these spaces became a kind of almost an ethnography in a way or something. But right, I mean, to look into the current state of eminent domain, I think would be fruitful. I appreciate that. I was not aware of what you were talking about in terms of the land reallocation schemes. I mean, that sounds more like technical adjustment of sites and not necessarily engaged with either the idealism of value capture or aesthetic kind of coordination. But no, I will look into those. I thank you for those those ideas. I think that'll be really fruitful for me. I appreciate that. And yeah, obviously, I mean, I want to believe still in the progressive era idealism that this might be a useful tool, right? So today we talk about value capture in various ways through taxation and special districts, but I mean, I think those are imprecise, right? It's very difficult to fully recoup investment to the public realm through those tools. So, right, I mean, I think this could still be a valuable policy tool. Yeah, so, yeah.
Thank you. Julia?
Thank you, Shlomo, and thank you, other panelists. So the 4 specific reforms we're looking at are civil service reform, where you have to, take exams and prove that you're worthy to work in city government. The adoption of at-large elections instead of ward-based elections, which makes it much more difficult for immigrant neighborhoods to elect, co-ethnics to the city council. The adoption of city manager form of government over elected mayors, and the adoption of nonpartisan over partisan ballots. And we think there's different mechanisms that might lead each of these to make it more difficult for immigrant communities to sort of gain political power and gain descriptive representation. And yeah, we're thinking hard about mechanisms that might then translate into labor market outcomes. We don't know if high-skilled immigrants might be more likely to move out of a city if it looks like their political power is trying to be wrested away, or whether it means that they are lacking access to these municipal civil service jobs. So yeah, this is definitely the next step, but thank you so much. It was a great question.
Could you just clarify for us the path to citizenship at that time? I mean, were these new immigrants, were they citizens or were they non-citizens?
So we just have whatever the census tells us, there's a citizenship question and then a country of origin question. And then we know also the citizenship of your parents. So we know whether you're first generation or second generation and country of origin. And then I know someone had asked in the chat about sort of controlling for length of time that your family has been in the US. And it's very easy to do that for first and second generation. It's going to be harder to do it going back, but I think it's a great point.
Victoria?
Yes, and thank you very much for your question and the example of Teddy Kollek, right? So let me say a couple of things here, because when we are talking about the dangers associated to promote engagement and participation, I think it's important to make a difference between asking experts to participate and asking citizens to participate. So I like to treat these as 2 different categories. I think that from my experience, I've been doing both for the last 10 years. And when you ask citizens to participate, normally you need to avoid these dangers that you are saying, you need to frame it in a way that avoids what you don't want to achieve from the very beginning. So if you don't want complaints and you want ideas, you better frame the participation as finding a solution for a concrete problem. So it's very important how you shape and how you moderate the conversation. But at the same time, it's important that the civil servants and the public officials and public managers that work in these processes feel that the process is not duplicating their work, it's really helping them. So in the case of the multi-city challenge, for example, what we did, it was involving the public officials in the first stage. So they were the ones defining the problem that will frame the challenge. So they had the power or the capacity to really set the tone of the conversation from the very beginning. And this was a strategy to socialize this and to institutionalize this, right? And in the case of experts, right, it's a little bit different from the case of the citizens, because in the case of the experts, to avoid what you are saying, you need to be clear that they are offering you solutions, but at the end of the day, you are the person responsible to decide. So it's a kind of assessment that you receive. And I want to paste in the chat for all of you another project that we did in the context of COVID, precisely using a network of experts, in which we framed 6 key topics about how to manage the COVID crisis at the institutional level. And we had experts assessing 6 governments, in this case in Latin America. And this was exactly this model, right? The experts were giving expertise and transforming recommendations into concrete implementation plans, but the governments had the freedom at the end of the day to decide what they were doing. So I think it's also a nice example to cover and to answer your question. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm afraid that we have taken up all the time for the panel, so we don't have time for questions or additional comments. I encourage you all to stay to hear from the doctoral students. Thank you all for participating. It was very enjoyable.
So hi, everyone. I won't talk too much or take too much more of your time today. But my name is Sam. I am a first-year student in the psychology department. And this is basically just a poster I made for the work I've been doing in my, so far in my first year. Basically stemming from information that eyewitness misidentification is the most common contributing factor in wrongful convictions, based on data from the Innocence Project as well as the National Exoneration List. We wanted to test essentially an attention intervention to see if the attention styles we ask people to give before they watch a crime video and participate in an eyewitness identification task, if we can, these different attention styles can help reduce the influence of prejudicial pre-existing beliefs that they have, and decrease reliance on prototypical markers of criminality, such as relying on the skin tone of someone to indicate whether or not they are someone who should be seen as more or less criminal. And we also assessed some measures of racism, status quo defense, which essentially is the belief in society that society is fair and doesn't need to be majorly overhauled in any way, and basically the system will treat everyone fairly as they deserve to be treated, as well as an arrest rate history statistic that we computed. So we computed this using zip codes from participants that they provided in the demographic section of our survey, and we used that along with the NYC open data that the NYPD puts out that tells us about the arrest rates in precinct areas, and we computed that to a zip code level data, and then combined it with US Census Bureau data to create the statistic of how many arrests there are in each zip code per 1,000 residents in that zip code. So basically what we did then in the study was we showed participants a crime video. This is just a still shot that you can see from the video of someone committing a crime, and then showed them comparisons of 2 photographs that they would see from the Chicago Face database. And these pairings, as you can see here, so in the horizontal, you can see that they had somebody who appeared lighter in skin tone and someone who appeared darker in skin tone. So we used Photoshop to manipulate the luminance value of these faces from the Chicago Face database, so that we could create this comparison. And so participants would have only seen one of these because, as you can see, the same 2 faces repeated. And then we used that to compute a measure of prototypicality, basically taking how likely participants thought the person with darker skin was to be the criminal in the video, and then subtracting out how likely they thought it was the person with lighter skin to be the person who was the criminal in the video. Basically what you can see in these first 2 top graphs are that people who were high in racism or high in the status quo defense, when they were left to their own devices for the natural attention condition, essentially that they were just told to watch the video how they naturally would watch anything, they were more likely to select someone who was very high in prototypicality, as you can see in these top 2. But then if you look at these purple lines, you can see that when we asked them to pay equal attention to the video, so they were instructed to give equal attention to all elements of the scene, all people in the scene, and things like that, that we can kind of see this effect of preference for prototypicality be reduced for both these high prejudicial group of subjects. And then what you can see in the bottom graph, which is something that we are hoping to explore more and is kind of preliminary data for us, is that people who are from high arrest rate areas, so areas of high arrest rate zip codes in New York City, when they're left to their natural attention conditions, they also pick someone who's highly prototypical, as opposed to when we ask them to give equal attention to the video, they do not show this bias for prototypicality. And yeah, that's pretty much the gist of the research that we're working on, and we're hoping to explore it more, but I'm really glad I got to share that with you guys today. Thank you.
And I guess I can go and try to be as quick as I can. So my name is Oscar Oliver-Didier. I am a first-year American Studies PhD student, but I am also an architect and urban designer. And as you'll see, that's why I'm very interested in multi-method and sort of visual ways of representing sort of research and ideas. So this is basically in a nutshell work that we did together, both me and folks from Design as Protest, a representative from that group, Gabriel Hernandez Solano, who also worked on these diagrams, and he's a protest photographer, and then with folks from Warriors in the Garden, which is another sort of group that sort of organized a lot of the protests of 2020 in New York City. And I worked there with Jon Xavier Acosta. So basically this research, which was very much more related to kind of documenting what was happening. So we would have like daily calls, daily Zoom calls, daily kind of conversations to try to see what was happening on the ground and ways of sort of documenting it. So we were working on this pretty much from like July all the way to September. So basically in a nutshell, I have like 3 points that can kind of summarize the work that we did. And sort of the ongoing process of what it could become. We sort of wanted to document these sort of fleeting practices and see them as actual glimpses into the future, in other words, for urban possibility, but also sort of those fleeting practices have a strong relationship to permanence, and how it relates is obviously that we can, as I just said, learn a lot from these and see how we can sort of become or work with these things in a more permanent manner. But also more importantly, at least for the instance of the work you're going to see now, it becomes a permanent record of police abuse, which is documented in multiple ways, both verbally, orally, or graphically. The second point is that obviously protests are performative in nature, but what we started discovering is that there is an incredible, almost militaristic organizational kind of roles that are developed. And some of these sort of include, and I can sort of start moving around to the other slide. You know, this includes like the bikers, the scouts, the traffic control, the PPE and snack teams, the frontliners who are both kind of documenting and are sort of laying out the groundwork for where the march goes or the protest goes, and then the legal and medical aid, which were all kind of present in all these things. And then the last point I wanted to raise is sort of like the defiance and Black joy as both a way of sort of occupying and co-opting public space, but also as a way of reprogramming and reimagining urban infrastructure. And I think there's multiple examples here, but one of the most important ones being the one in the bottom, the City Hall Autonomous Zone. The work that was done here by Gabriel is incredible. It sort of documents everything that was laid out there during that sort of month period from June to July. And it kind of shows the political activity that occurred there, the cultural production, community care of both the people who were there and even the homeless population nearby, and even just like the everyday life that was sort of occurring there, almost like a city within a city. There was a lot of talk during this time of these sort of the 50-minute neighborhoods, especially for neighborhoods that were mostly sort of Black and brown and sort of lacked a lot of these sort of services. And all of a sudden you had kind of like a pop-up 15-minute city being developed for a month period. So again, in a nutshell, we had worked with this to document everything that happened in the summer, and our sort of work now is sort of to kind of convert it into a more robust sort of theoretical work to see what can come from there. Thank you.